I'd like to share a Christmas story that means a lot to me. My mum read it to me as a little girl at Christmas at Blackberry Farm. If we're all sitting comfortably, I will begin. On Christmas Eve at Blackberry Farm, the moon was bright and the stars were shining twinkly, and from the light of the kitchen window it shone out across the snowy yard. The animals waited excitedly for Mrs. Smiles, the farmer's wife, to call them in. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Smiles called, and they all came hustling across the yard. First, Rusty the sheepdog, Ernest Owl and George the kitten, Mother Hen and Mary, Walter Duck, Lucy Mouse, Emily the goat, and little Martha the lamb followed. Scuttling beside them were Mrs. Squirrel and Hazel, and Mrs. Nibble with her 3 babies. But last but not least came Henry the pig, with Joe Robin begging him to hurry up so they wouldn't be late. And waiting for them all in the kitchen were Mr. and Mrs. Smiles and their children, Joy and Bob. Come in, cried Mrs. Smiles. Father Christmas is coming tonight, and you must all hang up your stockings before you go to bed." There were 3 large stockings, one for Emily, one for Henry, and one for Rusty. There were 9 middle-sized stockings, one for Joy, one for Bob, one for Mrs. Nibble, and one for the little Martha, one for Ernest Owl, and one for Walter Duck, one for Mother Hen, and one for George, and one for Mrs. Squirrel. And there were 7 small stockings, one each for the 3 bunnies, one each for Mary Hen and Joe Robin, and one each for Lucy Mouse and little Hazel the squirrel. Bob handed them out, and Ernest Owl had to speak sharply to George the kitten, who tried to get a large stocking instead of a middle-sized one. Then they all hung them up on the line in front of the kitchen fire, Lucy Mouse first because she was the smallest, and Henry the pig last because he was the biggest. And then they said goodnight to each other and went off to bed, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Smiles sat beside the fire thinking what a lovely large family they had at Blackberry Farm. The next morning was Christmas Day, and everyone was awake very early. When Joy and Bob rushed out across the yard before breakfast, they could hear all the animals chattering excitedly. "Happy Christmas, everyone," called Joy and Bob. "Happy Christmas," called back all the animals, and they came bouncing over the snow to the farm door as soon as they were let out, longing to see what was in their stockings. How exciting it all was! The stockings were bulging with lovely things. Rusty had a beautiful big bone, Ernest Owl had a large new pencil box, and the 3 bunnies each had a new bib and a new mug. Everyone had something nice, and they were all very, very happy. They went off to have their breakfast, clutching their new treasures. Mrs. Smiles had not enough room for everybody in the kitchen for Christmas dinner, so the animals had theirs around a large wooden table in the barn. Ernest Owl sat at one end and Henry Pig at the other. They had a large Christmas pudding and lots of mince pies, and plenty of paper hats and crackers. When they had eaten as much as they could and had pulled all the crackers and tied all the paper hats, they lay down full and happy and went to sleep until tea time. Then Mr. and Mrs. Smiles with Joy and Bob came down to the barn and lit the candles on the big Christmas tree, and Mrs. Smiles cut the big Christmas cake that she had made. They all played "Here We Go Gathering Nuts in May" and "Ring a Ring a Roses" and sang carols round the Christmas tree until it was time to go to bed. Then, tired and happy, the animals all said goodnight to Mr. and Mrs. Smiles and thanked them for a lovely Christmas day and trotted off to bed. And Joy and Bob said, "Thank you, Mummy and Daddy, for giving us all such a lovely time." Mr. and Mrs. Smiles kissed them both and said it had been one of the happiest days they had ever had at Blackberry Farm. Merry Christmas to you all.